This is part 2, episode 122. Hui Yuhao was evidently a little excited. He chuckled and said, "It's done, third senior brother. Just wait and see, this time, the Sun Moon Empire will definitely feel the pain in their bones." Xu Sanxia laughed and said, "I like that. Don't worry, everyone's in position. Go and take a rest." Yes, Hui Yuhao retrieved 2 milk bottles and crossed his legs as he sat down. He absorbed the soul power within those milk bottles as he activated his mysterious heaven technique at the same time so that he could replenish what he had expended from before. Wang Donger's figure suddenly appeared in his mind in that instant. How fantastic would it have been if Donger was here? With Donger around, we could use the Haodong power together, and that would help me recover a lot faster than using these milk bottles. Hui Yuhao's heart began to throb painfully when he thought about Wang Donger, and his excitement from before dropped a little. However, Hui Yuhao was a high-level soul master, and he was very aware of the effect inner demons had on cultivation. He quickly dispelled his thoughts and returned to calmness. Hui Yuhao's recovery abilities were very formidable. He leveraged his tremendous life energy and recovered most of his physical strength and spiritual power after a few moments. Hui Yuhao opened his eyes, and 2 cold lightning streaks seemed to flash across the night sky. Hui Yuhao nodded at Xu Sanxia, who was protecting him beside him, and said, "All right, that's good enough. I'm going, third senior brother." "All right. I'll back you up. Let's go." Xu Sanxia chuckled, and he surged into the air with Hui Yuhao at the same time. However, Hui Yuhao was flying towards the Sun Moon Empire while Xu Sanxia went straight up into the sky. Hui Yuhao was back in the air, and he flew to about 1,000 meters high. He returned to the edge of the Sun Moon Empire's aerial surveillance soul tools before he stopped, and retrieved a strange-looking soul tool from his pocket. This soul tool looked like a metal box. It wasn't very big, and it was about half a meter long, 30 centimeters wide, and 20 centimeters thick. This metal box's structure seemed a little crude, but one could tell upon closer inspection that the crudeness and roughness was actually caused by uncountable fine patterns aggregated together. There were many demonic patterns etched into the box. Hui Yuhao made several quick presses on its surface, and faint soul power undulated from the box. In the next moment, a single metal line protruded from its front and quickly stretched out to almost 2 meters long. The metal line's tip suddenly opened, and transformed into circle after circle of metal threads. The whole thing looked extremely strange. Hui Yuhao infused his soul power into the box and swiftly pressed a few more lines. The protruding metal threads glowed with circles of silver light as formless waves rippled outwards discreetly. "Teacher Xian, I hope your toy works," Hui Yuhao muttered to himself amusedly. High up in the sky over the horizon, there was a high-altitude aerial surveillance tool that had many auxiliary attachments open to help it hover in midair. The metal piece that was about the size of a palm at its tip suddenly lit up as whirlpool-like circles of light quickly appeared on top of it. That light was very strange, and gentle undulations emanated from its surface. The light suddenly became stronger, and lit up the area above this high-altitude aerial surveillance soul tool. Bam! A crisp sound could be heard, and wave after wave of electricity was released from that metal piece, which quickly surged inside the high-altitude surveillance soul tool. The high-altitude aerial surveillance soul tool was originally operating stably, but it suddenly began to tremble violently as the light on top of it became even more intense. The same situation happened to every single high-altitude aerial surveillance soul tool within hundreds of kilometers around. It seemed as if they were all malfunctioning. Inside the Sun Moon Empire's camp on the Mingdo mountain range. What? The high-altitude aerial surveillance soul tools are malfunctioning. We've lost communication. They were camped in a depression within the mountain, and they even bored a cave into the mountain for safety purposes. They were located not far behind the Mingdo mountain range's tallest peak, and they were specifically responsible for controlling all the surveillance soul tools in the area. This place could be called the Sun Moon Empire's intelligence headquarters in the Mingdo mountain range, and a Class 9 soul engineer was personally in charge of it. This Class 9 soul engineer was the Mad Bull de Law, Wang Ihan, who was also the commander of the evil tyrant Soul Engineer Legion. He was deployed here impromptu. The evil Tyrant Legion had switched guard duties with the Legion that was originally stationed here for one simple reason: the evil Tyrant Legion's sole engineers were the quickest, and they were the most skilled and adept at reacting to all kinds of situations. Wang Yiheng's face turned black as he listened to that sole engineer's report. Just several minutes ago, across several dozens of kilometers of the sky in front of the Mingdo mountain range's main peak, they lost contact with more than 20 high-altitude aerial surveillance Sol tools. This situation was unprecedented. If they lost contact with a single high-altitude aerial surveillance Sol tool, one could still say that the Sol tool had malfunctioned by itself. However, losing contact with so many at the same time, what did that mean? Somebody had done something to them. Even Title Dolor had trouble unleashing their abilities at an altitude of 3,000 meters. There might be reason to believe that someone had incapacitated a single high-altitude aerial surveillance Sol tool without being discovered, but incapacitating tens of those things at once. Could it be that tens of Title Dolor who were adept at concealing themselves had made a move at the same time? How was that possible? Not even the entire continent had so many Title Dolor who were good at concealing their tracks. Has the Patrol Legion been activated? They have been deployed, sir. I'm afraid they won't have enough manpower. Pass down my order: deploy the evil Tyrant Legion's dagger section, and they have to do everything they can to capture their enemies should they run into any. If they discover our high-altitude aerial surveillance Sol tools, they have to snatch them back. If we really can't take them back, we can't let them end up in the hands of the Star Luo Empire even if they are broken. Yes. Orders quickly came out from the intelligence headquarters. Wang Yiheng paced up and down inside his cave, and his expression was as black as could be. His back was drenched with sweat after pacing a few rounds. The Sun Moon Empire's high-altitude aerial surveillance Sol tools were immature, but they still represented the Sun Moon Empire's highest standard of surveillance Sol tools. If the Star Luo Empire managed to obtain and decipher those things, then he would have committed an unforgivable sin. No, I have to go. Wang Yiheng continued contemplating, but he wasn't assured enough, and immediately rushed out of the cave. He activated his Class 9 flying-type Sol tool and rose into the sky like a beam of light. He activated his communication Sol tools at the same time so that he could receive intelligence from their intelligence arm in real time. It was no wonder that Wang Yiheng couldn't figure out what was going on. The Sun Moon Empire had been very good at locking down the Star Luo Empire's surveillance capabilities over this period of time, and the Star Luo Empire had been suppressed to the point where they couldn't resist at all. High-altitude aerial surveillance Sol tools were more than 3,000 meters in the sky. They were about 2 meters in diameter, and seemed quite bulky. But that size was barely anything in the boundless horizons of the sky, and it wasn't even as large as a dust particle when viewed from afar. Looking for one was already difficult, let alone finding more than 20 across several hundred kilometers of the sky. What was more frightening was that his enemies could mess things up at the same time. That was just an unimaginable situation. The Sun Moon Empire had only made a little more than 100 such high-altitude aerial surveillance Sol tools, and this was the product of their latest research discoveries. They still needed to continue refining them afterwards, but all that refinement had to be based on the original foundations. Loss of even a single one was a terrible loss. Without discussing other things, the materials used to craft these Sol tools so that they could continuously operate at high altitudes meant these were top-grade materials used for crafting Sol tools. They had just lost more than 20 at once. Wouldn't the Sun Moon Empire's Emperor Xu Tianran go insane? Hu Yuhao was still hovering in midair, and the smile on his face became increasingly radiant. A small screen appeared on that metal box of his, and its display clearly showed that more than 20 green dots of light were flying in his direction. Furthermore, they were moving at an altitude of 3,000 meters. Very nice. Not even the Sun Moon Empire can possibly discover that I've stolen those things. Let me capture them. Hu Yuhao quickly surged into the sky, and began to fly towards an altitude of 3,000 meters. At this point, those high-altitude aerial surveillance Sol tools were flying towards him at speeds as fast as they could reach. The Sun Moon Empire's aerial surveillance Sol tools were completely useless at 3,000 meters, and his location wasn't close to the Mingdo mountain range. How could he be detected at that altitude? The metal pieces and the metal box with a metal thread that was more than 2 meters long were all newly developed creations by the master of the Tang sect Soul Tool Hall, Xianziwen. Furthermore, Xianziwen had custom-made those items for Hui Yuhao after he had brought that super-high aerial surveillance soul tool back the other time. This was a Class 8 soul tool, and it was the best possible one that Xianziwen could make. It was known as a long-range soul controller. Xianziwen had initially crafted this soul tool to remotely control his own aerial surveillance soul tools from a distance. The Sun Moon Empire was already very familiar with this technology, but Xianziwen made the effects of their long-range soul controllers even better, so that they could be used at even greater distances for remote control purposes. The Sun Moon Empire's aerial surveillance soul tools were controlled using similar mechanisms and attachments, but their receiving ends were installed inside them, while the metal piece that Hui Yuhao had used previously was installed on the outside. Xianziwen had made this thing after having an epiphany. He had quickly found loopholes in the high-altitude aerial surveillance soul tool after giving it a simple inspection. This was one of the illustrious Virtue Hall's most important research directions back when he was still there, and thus he knew a lot about them due to his position as their chief researcher. Therefore, he gave the long-range soul controller that he had created to Hui Yuhao after refining it. He added some unique and special formation arrays meant for controlling purposes on the metal piece. These formation arrays could generate intense jolts of energy that destroyed the control units within the soul tool, and the metal piece would hack into the soul tool at the same time and gain control over the entire control system of the high-altitude aerial surveillance soul tools. They could then be remotely controlled by the metal box in Hui Yuhao's hands from a long distance away. There were many complicated theories involved, and even Hui Yuhao wasn't very adept in this respect even though he was a Class 7 soul engineer. Of course, his long-range soul controller could only control high-altitude aerial surveillance soul tools after he had refined it. His soul tool couldn't control other kinds of soul tools. At this moment, Hui Yuhao used that feature to kidnap a bunch of high-altitude aerial surveillance soul tools. Just like what Wang Yiheng was worried about, the research conducted by the Doluo continent's 3 original nations towards surveillance soul tools would be greatly boosted if so many high-altitude aerial surveillance soul tools fell into Hui Yuhao's hands. Hui Yuhao could already see high-altitude aerial surveillance soul tools flying towards him one after another in the distance. However, he could also see beams of light flying out from the Mingdo mountain range one after another at the same time, and they were heading right toward this side. Hui Yuhao had already predicted this a long time ago. The Sun Moon Empire had just lost contact with so many high-altitude aerial surveillance soul tools at the same time. Things would really be strange if they didn't react. I hope the title Doluo or a Class 9 soul engineer doesn't appear first from the enemy's party. Hui Yuhao glanced at the metal box in his hands, and he squinted a little as he activated spiritual detection to its highest possible level. There were self-destructive mechanisms installed in his long-range soul controllers, so he could still destroy those high-altitude aerial surveillance soul tools if he couldn't take them away. However, that was a last resort. His heart would ache if he had to destroy so many precious things. The value of just the rare metals involved in crafting them was already unimaginable. The first high-altitude aerial surveillance soul tool quickly flew before Hui Yuhao. He swiftly went up, and the light on his starlight sapphire storage ring flashed once before it swallowed the entire thing. First one. Because every single high-altitude aerial surveillance soul tool varied in distance from each other, their arrivals were bound to be staggered even if they started flying towards Hui Yuhao at the same time. Second one. Third one. It didn't take long before Hui Yuhao had pocketed 6 high-altitude aerial surveillance soul tools in his starlight sapphire storage ring. Seems like I'll return with uncountable rewards and gains. However, 5 shadows swiftly bore down on him at this moment. These 5 shadows didn't come together, but were separated in the sky. Hui Yuhao had activated imitation and his spiritual interference domain, and it was very hard to discover his presence. Hui Yuhao had already seen them coming a long time ago with spiritual detection. Every single one of these 5 soul engineers carried detectors in their hands, and these detectors were the most advanced oscillation detectors, things that Hui Yuhao wasn't immune to. Even though they didn't know Hui Yuhao's particular location, they could cover a large area of effect if they stretched their detectors in all directions. They would discover Hui Yuhao as long as they figured out his rough location. These people were currently coming closer to Hui Yuhao's position. Hui Yuhao swept his mind towards the sky in the distance with spiritual detection, and the other high-altitude aerial surveillance soul tools that were still gathering rapidly. The safest decision for Hui Yuhao would be to turn tail and run, before destroying the ones that he couldn't keep. He would deal severe losses to his opponents and would also return with a decent harvest. But he couldn't resign himself to making that decision. He could only use this method once, his enemies wouldn't be tricked the next time. Even one extra soul tool stolen was another giant pot of wealth gained. Hui Yuhao contemplated for a moment before he decisively withdrew the metal box in his hands, and then turned around and went straight for lower altitudes. The high-altitude aerial surveillance soul tools that were hurrying over would gather at this location. Hui Yuhao was certain that he didn't have enough time to gather them all, so he took the initiative to reveal himself so that he could attract his enemy's attention, so that he could preoccupy them. Perhaps he could even defeat them in battle, so that he could buy time for those super-high surveillance soul tools to fly over before taking everything away after that. That would undoubtedly be the best outcome. Before he executed this operation, Hui Yuhao had considered asking the White Tiger Duke to deploy Soul Masters to help him. However, normal Soul Masters couldn't even come near this region without being discovered by the aerial surveillance soul tools, so only he could conceal himself while maintaining himself at such a height. I'll take this chance. If it doesn't work, then I'll run. Hui Yuhao had become a lot more courageous after the Sky Dream Iceworm had reminded him of the benefits that the Beast God's reverse scale could bring him. Hui Yuhao plunged downwards quickly, and immediately changed directions towards the side after he dropped to about 2,000 meters. He didn't remove the effects of imitation and his spiritual interference domain because that would have been too obvious. His enemies might not be tricked if they were smart. He flew across their flanks, and the oscillation detector that the Sun Moon Empire's Soul Engineer on the leftmost side was holding had a reaction. Over here. He immediately informed his partners with his communication soul tool. A heavy black cannon instantly appeared on his shoulders, and he fired off a shot in Hui Yuhao's direction according to the location shown to him by his oscillation detector. A bolt of bluish-purple light fired out. Hui Yuhao's opponent's prediction was very accurate. If Hui Yuhao had continued flying forward, he would have very likely collided with this cannon shell. Class 6 Lightning Cannon, Fierce. The Sun Moon Empire's Soul Engineers who were responsible for intelligence and detection were the strongest ones. Previously, Hui Yuhao had discovered that 2 Soul Engineers among his 5 enemies were Class 7 Soul Engineers who were also Soul Sages, while the other 3 were Class 6 Soul Engineers. There was hardly anybody in the world better than Hui Yuhao at prediction. Hui Yuhao's frame suddenly halted midair as the cannon shell closed in on him, and the wings behind his back closed up before he began plunging downwards in free fall. Hui Yuhao had used this move very often, and its effectiveness was time-tested. Normal Soul Masters didn't dare to behave like him. Dropping down was easy, but stopping the free fall would create such a heavy load that their bodies couldn't take the pressure even if they had enough soul power. Boom! An intense explosion cracked open above his head, and large swathes of lightning bolts covered several hundred square meters around him. If Hui Yuhao's reaction had been a little slower, he would have immediately been struck by those lightning bolts. The other Soul Engineers had reacted by then, and they were swiftly moving to outflank him. Of course, Hui Yuhao wouldn't just defend passively. He wasn't just a Soul Master, he was also a Soul Engineer. A sphere of brilliant blue light surged from his chest as he fell. One could tell upon closer inspection that there was a necklace hanging around his neck, and the pendant was what was shining with blue light. This pendant seemed as large as a pigeon's egg. It could only be seen through his clothes, but one could still see the radiant and brilliant blue light that was apparently from a soul tool crafted with starlight sapphire as its main body. Light flashed again and again as blue light swiftly covered Hui Yuhao's entire body, including his head. It didn't take long before his entire body was covered in dark blue armor. This dark blue armor was filled with a kind of streamlined elegance, and it covered every single part of Hui Yuhao's body. The flying-type soul tool behind Hui Yuhao's back had come off because of that, and Hui Yuhao withdrew it into his storage ring. 3 pairs of dark blue wings quickly stretched out behind his back, and fired out blue light to stabilize his body. His helmet was like a dome that covered his head, and even his face was covered. There was an opening on his forehead, and there was a pale blue jewel in that opening. Yes, this was the human-shaped soul tool that Xianziwen had tailor-made for Huayu Hao. The Sun Moon Empire had spent the longest time researching human-type soul tools. Back then, Huayu Hao had stolen that giant human-type soul tool. That item ended up in Xianziwen's hands, and it was ultimately torn to pieces. The illustrious Virtue Hall and the Sun Moon Empire's world of soul engineers had always been going in two directions with their research into human-shaped soul tools. One direction was towards a giant human-shaped soul tool that was represented by the Hall Master of the illustrious Virtue Hall, Jing Hongchen. Jing Hongchen and many soul engineers believed that soul tools could only store more soul power when they had enough volume, and only then could they possess even stronger fighting strength to effect a battle. On the other hand, Xianziwen and several other soul engineers led a second direction. They wanted to minimize human-shaped soul tools. Xianziwen believed that even though giant human-shaped soul tools could have stronger and more forceful soul tools installed on them, and more milk bottles to store soul power could also be attached, that large volume would become clumsy, and a source of extreme inconvenience. The giant human-shaped soul tool would become very difficult to control, and they were more easily targeted and attacked by enemies. They would consume enormous amounts of soul power at the same time, and the pros didn't outweigh the cons. These two different schools couldn't do anything to convince the other side, so they immersed themselves in their respective research directions. There were more soul engineers who subscribed to the giant human-shaped soul tool, therefore this direction was the mainstream in the illustrious Virtue Hall back then. Even though Xianziwen didn't approve of that research direction, he had had no choice but to conduct research in the same direction. Otherwise, he wouldn't have had any chances to be involved with the newest technological findings in this area. Huayu Hao had given the giant human-shaped soul tool to Xianziwen, and it was extremely important for Xianziwen's research in soul tools. He summarized the giant human-shaped soul tool's pros and cons, and then acted according to his own principles and combined that with the human-shaped soul tool that Huayu Hao had crafted back then with the Tang San's mechanical techniques, and thus created his own school. Xianziwen had conducted countless experiments before he finally presented this final product to Huayu Hao. Xianziwen had called the human-shaped soul tool that Huayu Hao was wearing a Class 7 soul tool. Even though it was Class 7, Xianziwen was most satisfied with this creation amongst his many others. This product combined his own research, the illustrious Virtue Hall's research findings, and the Tang San's mechanical techniques. Back then, when research in human-shaped soul tools reached a certain standard, the most important point that puzzled soul engineers was how to control these soul tools. From their perspective, soul tools could never be as agile or flexible as soul masters, no matter how inherently flexible they were. This was one of the most important reasons why smaller human-shaped soul tools weren't recognized or approved of. Since they couldn't be flexible or agile enough, these soul tools could only rely on force to fix their problems. Therefore, giant human-shaped soul tools were recognized. However, once research in giant human-shaped soul tools reached a certain standard, the Sun Moon Empire's soul engineers discovered that controlling such an item wasn't something that a single soul master could achieve by himself. Even if those soul tools could be controlled through some complex formation arrays, the human-shaped soul tool would become extremely clumsy and bulky. Moving them around on the battlefield was difficult, and they could only be used as soul tool forts. That meant the entire motivation for creating human-shaped soul would be lost. Under such circumstances, the Sun Moon Empire's soul engineers thought of something to resolve this, to control large amounts of complex formation arrays so that giant human-shaped soul tools could become agile. They could only rely on an individual's thoughts and consciousness to control those soul tools rather than one's hands using all kinds of remotes. However, this had a very high demand for spiritual power, and not even Class 9 soul engineers were certain to be able to meet this demand unless they were Class 9 spiritual type titled Doluo. Only then could they accomplish this. However, spiritual type titled Doluo were very rarely seen across the continent, while most of the Sun Moon Empire's soul masters were soul engineers. This meant spiritual type ones were even fewer and further between. That was the reason why this research dropped into a bottleneck when it reached that point. On the other hand, Xianziwen didn't have that problem with his research. First, he was researching small-scale versions, and Soul Masters could use their limbs to activate the mechanical parts in order to control them. At the same time, he didn't give up on the idea of Soul Masters controlling human-shaped soul tools with their consciousness and their spiritual power. Hui Yuhao was a live spiritual-type Soul Master. Furthermore, he would undoubtedly be able to become a titled Dolor in the future. At the same time, smaller human-shaped soul tools required much less spiritual power for movement. Therefore, Xian Ziwen began to gradually craft this particular item according to his own theories and principles. After Hui Yuhao put on this human-shaped soul tool, the space in between his eyebrows swiftly pressed against a transparent jewel as his consciousness and thoughts swiftly translocated throughout the entire human-shaped soul tool. In this moment, he felt as if the entire human-shaped soul tool itself had become a part of his body, and controlling it was no different from controlling his body with his mind. Furthermore, all the attachments and mechanisms within the human-shaped soul tool were all within his thoughts' control. Hui Yuhao hadn't even activated his Eye of Destiny, and controlling such a Class 7 soul tool with the strength of his spiritual power was very easy. It wasn't because Xian Ziwen didn't want to create a Class 8 human-shaped soul tool, his problem was that he didn't have sufficient good materials. Another limiting factor for a small human-shaped soul tool was the user's bodily strength and endurance. If the soul tool itself wasn't as strong as the Soul Master's body, or if its defenses couldn't compare to that of the user, then what use did it have? Xian Ziwen gave himself a marker for a Class 8 human-shaped soul tool's defensive capability. Such an item had to at least be able to take a hit from a titled Dolor, but the material required became a crucial problem in achieving that goal, and it was a large one at that. He couldn't resolve this problem in his current circumstances. Hui Yuhao's speed was greatly boosted with the human-shaped soul tool. He wasn't willing to use this human-shaped soul tool in front of the White Tiger Duke. In the end, this was something so valuable that even the Sun Moon Empire's soul engineers would be moved by it. This item also represented the product of the Tang sect's research into soul tools. Just like how the Sun Moon Empire would never want their high-altitude aerial surveillance soul tools to end up in their enemies' hands, Hui Yuhao would never want this soul tool's secret to be known by others, friend and foe alike. 3 pairs of wings spurted with light, and Hui Yuhao's body swung in midair as he instantly picked up speed. He immediately charged towards the soul engineer who had just fired a shot at him. The position that Xian Ziwen had given him wasn't long-range combat, instead, it was close combat. The reason for that was because close combat was Hui Yuhao's forte, and his strength would be boosted once more through the human-shaped soul tool, so that his fighting strength and survival capability could be raised even further. This was the motivation for Xian Ziwen in creating this soul tool. Hui Yuhao's speed was raised by almost 100% in that moment with the help of his Class 7 human-shaped soul tool, and he reached the standards of a soul Dolor. He managed to come close to the soul engineer who had used the lightning cannon within 2 blinks of an eye. That soul engineer had his lightning cannon on his shoulder, and his oscillation detector had been focusing on Hui Yuhao's location this entire time. He suddenly realized that there was a small bright dot on his oscillation detector that was swiftly coming towards him, and he was absolutely shocked. However, he was a veteran soul engineer, and his reactions were also incredibly quick. He had no time to withdraw the oscillation detector in his hands. He opened his hands and immediately threw it away. At the same time, a white barrier immediately emerged outward with his body as the center. Class 7 Protective Soul Barrier. This was a Class 7 soul engineer. That wasn't all. A layer of golden light glowed on his body immediately afterwards. He was the leader of this 5-man team, and he even carried an invincible barrier that could only be used once. This item wasn't standard issue in the Sun Moon Empire because it was simply too expensive. He had crafted it himself after saving up enough for the materials. Hui Yuhao's speed had astonished him, because that speed could only mean that his enemy was a soul Dolor. He didn't want to be obliterated in one hit, so he acted decisively, and used his invincible barrier. However, what he didn't expect was that the heavy hit in his imagination never came. The light suddenly plunged down when it was about 100 meters away from him, and the oscillation detector that had fallen from his hands from before suddenly vanished in midair. Afterwards, the light began dashing towards his flank at an incredible speed. "Watch out, little four!" He began to shout hysterically. Yes, Hui Yuhao didn't attack him, because attacking a Class 7 Soul Engineer who was using a Class 7 Invincible Barrier took too much energy and effort. Invincible barriers could only be sustained for a very limited duration, so why would he waste his time? Hui Yuhao managed to grab the oscillation detector. What a fantastic toy! This is a Class 6 Soul tool. No, it's not a Class 6 Soul tool, because it wouldn't be able to have a range like it did just now. Hui Yuhao thought to himself in admiration as he raced 1,000 meters horizontally, and arrived in front of another Soul Engineer. This Soul Engineer's reaction was very quick as well. He swiftly withdrew his oscillation detector and activated his protective Soul Barrier at the same time. He opened his hands, and two light blades stretched out from his hands. He swung them around very quickly, and they cocooned his entire body like a sphere. He was actually a close combat Soul Engineer, and he seemed like he was quite strong. 6 soul rings glowed on his body, 2 yellow, 3 purple, and 1 black. Real battle wasn't like a practice fight. Nobody would feel like conserving their soul skills during crucial moments, and this Soul Engineer behaved in the same manner. The soul ring that lit up on his body was the last and 6th one, his black soul ring. An enormous white sphere emerged from behind his back. It seemed like a white turtle shell. There were countless patterns on its surface, and this turtle shell swiftly transformed into pieces that began waltzing around this close combat Soul Engineer, a shield formation. A defense-type Soul Engineer similar to third senior brother? He uses his martial soul for defense and soul tools for offense, not a bad choice. He lives up to his status as one of the Sun Moon Empire's elites. There aren't many Soul Engineers and soldiers that the Sun Moon Empire has left guarding the Mingdo mountain range, but they are all the elites, and quality has been used to resolve the problem of quantity. But can defenses like that stop me? This Soul Engineer was all tensed up as he activated both his defensive and offensive capabilities. The others were swiftly coming closer to him, and they only needed 3 seconds. He would only have to defend himself for 3 seconds before reinforcements would arrive. 3 seconds. Just 3 seconds. This Class 6 Soul Engineer was very confident in himself. His enemy didn't attack his team leader, who was a Class 7 Soul Engineer, and that meant he wasn't confident of doing so. Since that was the case, his enemy shouldn't be stronger than his team leader, or perhaps he was just a little stronger. With my defensive abilities, how can I not be able to hang on for 3 seconds? His judgment was actually very accurate. In terms of soul power, Hui Yuhao's standard was similar to that of his team leader. They were both soul sages, but could their strengths be the same as well? Hui Yuhao had obliterated an 8-ringed evil soul master when he only had 5 rings. When he had just obtained his 7th ring, he managed to kill a 100,000-year evil eye tyrant. How could power such as that be measured purely with soul power? A crack seemed to suddenly appear in midair. This crack wasn't very obvious, and the Class 6 Soul Engineer could only see a sharp claw that seemed to appear out of nowhere, along with a dark golden shadow that carried a stifling sharpness, and flash by in front of him in the next moment. He was still swinging his blades effortfully. However, he suddenly felt his body going cold, as if everything had become different. All the clouds and mountains seemed to freeze, and everything that he had been able to control could no longer be controlled. He was stunned momentarily, and he realized in the next moment that he was falling from the sky, in free fall. It's so dark. Why can't I see anything anymore? Yes, a sharp claw did come out from the sky. There was only one, and it was a dark gold, razor-sharp claw. Hui Yuhao's dark golden terror claw. Frightening sharpness tore his enemy's body apart in an instant. Naturally, his enemy couldn't control anything anymore. Hui Yuhao's dark golden terror claw in his right hand had power comparable to a strike from a 10,000-year dark golden terror claw bear's all-out attack, along with his increasing prowess. How could explosive power that came so quickly be something that a Soul Emperor, a Class 6 Soul Engineer, could resist? Even 8-ringed Soul Dolor would feel afraid when Hui Yuhao was near them, let alone Soul Engineers. Hui Yuhao succeeded with 1 hit, and the dark gold light disappeared after a single flash. Terrifying soul rays and cannons condensed into a hurricane immediately erupted towards where Hui Yuhao had attacked from. However, he was already far from that location, and every explosion and attack didn't affect him at all. Instant teleportation. The skill that belonged to his left leg bone. He had already used instant teleportation in the moment right after he made his attack, and Hui Yuhao didn't even bother observing that Class 6 Soul Engineer that he had just attacked. What soul barrier, light blades, 10,000-year defensive soul skills in the face of his dark golden terraclaw that had been infused with soul power and spiritual power, all of those meant nothing. He's over there. The remaining 4 soul engineers quickly found Hui Yuhao's location with their oscillation detectors. However, Hui Yuhao was simply moving too quickly. He rushed towards another Soul Emperor with a few explosive flashes before the 4 of them could surround him, and managed to break out in the end with imitation. 2 Soul Sages and 2 Soul Emperors, those were his 4 remaining opponents. Hui Yuhao turned and stared at a Class 7 Soul Engineer who had a piercing cannon on his shoulders as he was bolting forward. In the next moment, all this Class 7 Soul Engineer could see was blinding purplish golden light. Boom! A crackling boom appeared in his head, and the 3 others looked on in utter astonishment as this Class 7 Soul Sage's head suddenly exploded. Red and white parts splattered and flew in all directions. He didn't even get to fire his piercing cannon before his body plummeted towards the ground like a falling rock. This sudden change in circumstance shocked the other 3, while at this very moment, Hui Yuhao collided into the Soul Emperor that he was targeting. Part 2 end here.